Hello and welcome to Invertebrate Paleontology and Paleobotany at Utah State University. This is lecture 30, in which we'll ask the question, how did plants become the forests during the Carboniferous period, during the Mississippian and Pennsylvanian periods of time? Alright, now there's lots of plants that start to proliferate during this period of time, during the Carboniferous. And we could go into detail with many of these different groups, but we're going to focus onto two groups today with this lecture. And the first is the ones labeled L here. These are the Lycopsids. We'll look at those. Those include the club mosses, but during the Carboniferous they were the dominant plant around, and they were the first types of plants that actually produced trees, or what we would call trees, even though that they are more closely related to the club mosses today, which don't form trees. And the other group are the ferns. So we'll talk a little bit about the ferns. And some of the ferns themselves actually became very large and tree-like during the Carboniferous. So we'll focus on those two groups. And then we're going to follow up with a lecture after this where we'll look at the horsetails. And the horsetails, which are living today, also became very large and tree-like as well during the Carboniferous. So there's a time in which many of these early plants, these early terrestrial plants, were really playing around with how to become very big and very large. And this is going to lead to a whole diversity of these very primitive plants becoming the forests, but they're very different forests than we have today. And that plants were not seed plants. They were still doing sexual reproduction with the reliance of water. And we'll talk a little bit about that in this lecture. So the Lycopsids are the club mosses. These are the oldest group of true vascular plants. They are living today, they're extinct, and so we have species of club moss today, and you can actually grow club moss in planters. What's really interesting about club mosses is that they retain the alternating generation, so they produce spores. But what's different about these guys than the bryophytes is that the sporophyte generation, that is the generation that produces the spores, that's the diploid generation, is the dominant generation that we're going to see in both club mosses and ferns as well. So it's the sporophytes that really become the trees. These are oftentimes grouped into a classification called microphyls. Now, microphyll basically means that these have tiny leaves. So club mosses today, even the living ones, have very small leaves, and we'll see that in the fossil record as well. So these don't produce the big broad leaves that we have in many plants. And so we classify these groups, these primitive groups of plants, under the term microphyls, which basically mean small leaves. And they only have a single vein, so they kind of resemble more like a conifer needle than they do, or what you see on horsetails, than what you see in sort of like an apple tree. The other thing is that these guys are vascular, and so we're going to look at how they actually construct their vascular tissues inside. Now this is going to be important because one of the things that these plants are going to do is to get big, they have to provide a methodology, a method for getting the water up from the ground up into these big tree-like structures to grow high. And so we're going to look at, they have a stem that's a protostele stem, and we'll look at the distribution of the xylem. This is going to be the wood part, and the phloem is going to be the bark part of these trunks of these primitive trees. All right, so let's look at the vascularization of these plants. This is referred to as the protostele. And in a hapastele, this is the more primitive type, what you see is that the coelom is in the center. So that's going to be the really tough part of the plant, of the stem, that's going to provide the rigid support. And then around that in a circle is going to be the opening that's going to provide for the capillary action of the water to be drawn into the stem of these primitive stems. And then surrounding that is the phloem. This is going to be sort of like the woody interior and then the bark on the outside. And then it's through the capillary action along these stems that you get the water drawn up. Now, one of the things that you see with many of these groups is that they start to expand the surface area in which the water can be drawn through these networks, through the vascular morphology of these stems. And so you get this actostela, where you get sort of invaginations, more surface area that can help draw up through capillary action the water And then you get other ones that are like pectostelates, where you actually have sort of divisions within the vascular flow of these tubes through the stems, these primitive stems. So when we look at a lot of these early ones, and this is going to include the horsetails as well, we're going to be looking at probably haplostellate and actostellate sort of morphologies in terms of drawing up that water through the vascular framework, the network, in the more woody parts of these plants. All right, so the lycoopsids sort of branch off and become unique from these primitive bryophytes, and the fossil record of these lycoopsids extends into the Devonian, so they're the most primitive of the terrestrial plants, the most primitive of the vascular plants. And one of the things that they do is they don't really necessarily have, many of the primitive ones don't necessarily have roots yet. They're just basically growing upward, and to support that growth upward, and they are basically becoming more vascular. So they're having a woody part that they're secreting with the cells, the coelom, and that's providing some support for these to get higher and higher up into the air. And there's two reasons they're getting higher up in the air. One is to increase the area for photosynthesis, so it's sort of a competition. The higher you are, the more photosynthesis you can do. And then the other thing is for the spores. So the spores are going to be released from these top stalks of these plants, and that's another reason to get higher up, so that your spores will get distributed further away if you get higher up where there's more wind, and you can distribute those spores much further geographically if you're higher up. So many of these plants were starting to grow high, and there was advantage to being higher up, evolutionary advantage to being higher up in the canopy there. Now, many of these primitive lycoopsids resemble some of the club mosses that are living today, and we can actually study club mosses to understand how these early forests were beginning to be developed. So this is Herperatia. It's an early club moss. Club mosses are really fascinating. You can grow them in, many people grow them into planters, so they make great house plants. They keep growing. Now realize that what you're growing here is going to be the sporophytes. So these are going to produce spores. They're going to produce these spores, and you can take the spores and you can plant them, and then they'll come up a new sporophyte. Many of these club mosses are epiphytes. That means that they grow on other trees and stuff, especially if there's a wet area that they can grow. And they're called club mosses because they produce these big sort of clubs or stalks that grow up. Now, during the Carboniferous, many of these clubs and stalks that grew up to get pretty high eventually became the size of trees and became very, very large. But living club mosses do quite well. They get pretty high. They get pretty high stalks. You'll note that these club mosses, although they're mixed with other plants, they don't necessarily have the broad leaf structures that we see with many modern plants living today. And so we're going to see later on, as we get further on, we'll see that many of these plants start to develop very broad leaf structures. So these are microphyll plants. They have the tiny, tiny needle-like leaves. All right, so now the lycoopsids have a very complicated way of reproduction because they're still relying on the fact that they have flagellated sperm, and so sexual reproduction has to occur in a wet zone. And what they do is really fascinating. So the spore that's laid down, produced by these plants, these big plants, will fall down onto the ground, and oftentimes they like it really wet, of course, and these spores can sink down into the ground, and they open up and they grow the Gammafight. Now the Gammafight's really interesting. It doesn't photosynthesize. It's underground, and it's really teeny. In fact, many times you don't see it because it's so small in the dirt. Now these spores will open up and it'll form a little teeny plant. They'll have a little bit of a rhizolyth that gets some nutrients from the soil, but then it's going to produce a antheridium and an archegodium. So the antheridium and the archegodium are going to be, a lot of times it's hermaphroditic, so it'll be on the same little Gammafite in the soil. It's going to produce sperm and eggs, and of course the sperm are going to get released into, whenever it gets really wet and the soil is really damp, those sperms can get out and they can swim with the flagellated little tails and find an egg. And then from that fertilized egg, from that zygote, then you get the sporophyte generation. and you produce the plant growing from that little kernel there of the Gammafight. It grows out of it and grows into a big, huge plant that then produces lots and lots of sperm, or not sperm, but lots and lots of spores, and those spores then can split off, and of course those spores can be either male or female Gammaphytes, but in this case many times they're hermaphroditic, and they produce just these Gammaphytes that grow underground and don't photosynthesize. What's really remarkable about many of these club mosses is that they have a very long dormancy during that period of time of the spore developing into the Gammafight generation, about 7 years in many cases. So they need to live in very wet environments where there's going to be a lot of rainfall for the sexual reproduction to occur in the soils. And then this whole generation, the Gammafight generation, is just lost. We don't really see it because these are very small structures in the soil. And so the only thing that we see is the sporophyte generation of these club mosses. Now I mentioned that as we venture into the late Devonian and go into the Carboniferous, into the Mississippian period of time, we start to see that many of these primitive club moss type plants, the Lycaopsids, start to become more tree-like. They start to grow. And what's really interesting is that they grow sort of like root-like structures that will help support them, because as you get taller and bigger, you're going to have some sort of support, or the wind or anything can knock you down. So many of these first trees basically were growing up from the ground with a support system that kind of helped support them. They weren't necessarily the true root structures that we see today. So this is a diagram here. Now notice that there are names that are tied to each one of these. These are form names. So the Stegomera is the form name for the roots that are fossilized. Leptodendron is for the bark, and then the Leptostrobus is for the spore-like structures that you see, and then the Leptophilius is for the leaf-like structures. So they're every portion of these plants, because they're getting big and they're getting more complicated, gets a new form name. And of course, as they grow, we get the xylem in the center, and we get the phylum on the outside, and so as it grows you get this sort of bark. Now the bark of these lycophytes is really unusual. You often will see, because these are going to be supporting little tiny leaves coming out, they have these scale-like features on the Lycaopsids. So oftentimes if you're searching for fossils during the Carboniferous, during the Mississippian and Pennsylvanian periods, you're going to find many of the wood, the bark will have this sort of pattern, and you can use that pattern to identify the form taxa of many of these Lycaopsids in these primitive forests during the Carboniferous. So these are some reconstructions of what some of them look like. A lot of them are kind of like club moss, so they come up with a big stalk. They don't have the big leaves that you see in modern modern trees today. These are very needle-like leaves, and they sort of change as they grow up. They get bigger and bigger, and so you see there's a whole bunch of variety of these Lycaopsids. Now the biggest thing to think about is that the xylem and the phylum, these portions of the vascular trunks of these, had to support the water to go up through these. And so they're doing it in a very unique way that's very different than what we'll see in later on trees living today. In many places in both Europe and in the eastern part of North America, we find lots and lots of these fossil plants. This is Stigmera. This is a museum piece showing the complicated network of these root-like structures that are grown to help support these early trees. Beautiful pieces of wood have been found, fossilized wood with this unique pattern of these Lycaopsids that you don't really see in any plants living today. So all the club moss that are relatives of these Carboniferous forests are small, and so we don't see these big things anymore. But during the Carboniferous, the club moss were the big trees, were the big forest producers during this period of time. Now the Lycaopsids are a very diverse group. They become very diverse during the Carboniferous, but after the Carboniferous they become less important. They have a little bit of difficulty in competing with the seed plants, the early gymnosperms, and we'll talk about those later on in a few lectures ahead of us. But also during this period of time, there's a lot of other little groups that are popping up. Many of those are discussed in the textbook, but I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the other groups. And one in particular is a really fascinating one, and that's the Trimerophytopsidae, or the Trimerophytes. These are the first plants that really kind of have more of a bushy appearance. So unlike the single little leaf structures that you're seeing on many of these are the first groups that start to have interesting sort of structures in terms of how they're actually growing. The important thing, though, is that many of these all of these are producing spores, and so they have these little structures on them that pop open and release spores, rather than necessarily the seeds that we'll see later on with the first seed plants. So they have the two generation, the Gammafight generation's just very dormant, lives underground, or lives, we don't see it in the fossil record, and what we're seeing in the fossil record is the Sporophyte generation, these bigger plants that are producing spores. And what's really remarkable about many of these is that they look very similar to what you see in many modern plants, although we don't have the big leaves yet. And this one right down here, this is Paraticta. This is the state fossil of Maine. All right, now there is another group of plants that were also living at this time, and that is the ferns. They're either classified in the Monophytes or the Pteratophyta, depending on what I think our textbook uses, the old Pterophyta nomenclature. So the ferns are an interesting group because unlike the Lycaopsids that we just looked at, they actually have fairly big leaves. So they have true leaves. Now the leaves are, of course, arranged in this unique pattern, sort of alternating pattern, as they split off from the branches. Now ferns are then placed into the megaphylls. These are the bigger leaf group of plants. But ferns also lack seeds, and they lack flowers, and they lack the fruit and seeds that we see, and instead produce the spores, just like we see in the Lycaopsids and modern club moss, and even modern ferns today produce only spores. So we'll take a look at that as well. They also have the coelom and phylum, so they're vascular, and during the Carboniferous period of time, they were able to also grow really large and become sort of tree-like as well. All right, so let's look at the ferns' life cycles. Now, ferns are pretty diverse today, and so they are a unique group to look at in terms of their life cycle, and it's very similar to the club mosses. So when you have most of the ferns produce spores. The spores are released, they fall down into the ground, and they basically start to grow, and they grow into the Gammafight generation. So there can be boy and female parts. Sometimes they are also hermaphroditic. That means they have both female and male parts on them. And then they start to grow. And what's really interesting about the Gammaphytes of ferns is that they're very small. Some of them have the ability to do some photosynthesis, although they're really small and most of the time are underground. And they form sort of like a little leaf-like structure there. And that platform is where they're going to produce the eggs and the sperm. So the sperm, again, is flagellated. It needs the water to swim to fertilize the eggs. So when water comes, it fills up that little cup of that leaf structure. And these are really tiny. And then it releases these sperm. The sperm goes over and starts to fertilize the various archegodium where the egg resides. And then once that egg is fertilized, it becomes a zygote. And from that, then you get the Sporophyte generation that grows out of that Gammafight. And so then that Sporophyte grows up, and it just starts to throw, of course, its big fronds out there. And the Sporophyte is the generation of ferns that you see all around us with ferns. So on these fronds, on these leaves, then are out there. They're both photosynthesizing, but they're also producing spores for the next generation. So if you ever look at ferns, you can flip over the leaves, and on the bottom of the leaves you often will see these round little circles. These little clusters are called sorus, and these are basically sporangia. These are the spore-producing parts of the ferns, and you oftentimes will see these on rows, little dots underneath those leaves. So those are producing spores. Those spores will then drop down into the soil, and then from those spores we get the Gammafights that we just don't see because they're so tiny. So from that Gammafight generation, you get the growth of the Sporophyte generation out of the Archegodium in those little teeny Gymnophytes, and you get, boom, a Fiddle Stick. So a Fiddle Stick is coming up, and that's how ferns kind of grow out, is in these Fiddle Sticks, and then they then open up their fronds and start to grow and photosynthesize. So think of these Fiddle Sticks as the sort of analog to those early sporophyte generations in the bryophytes that were setting up those shoots to get up high to release the spores. Now the Gammafights are teeny, I mean really teeny. This is a picture of one. That scale bar is 1 milliliter, so these things are teeny. They're sort of microscopic in size, so very, very small, and they only sit around and produce both the eggs and the sperm in the soils. They kind of wait for really wet rainfall, and then they produce that sexual reproduction that goes on in the water, and then they grow. So this is something important to think about too with ferns, is that this is the only stage in which they really need a very wet environment. But it has to be damp enough for that sperm to swim around in the water. So they can lay these in areas that are seasonally dry, and then during the wet season they can do their fertilization of sexual reproduction. They can also colonize areas with their spores, but they're going to have issues if that area is not moist or not wet during those periods of time that they need to do the sexual reproduction. So fossil ferns are plentiful, and ferns have an amazing fossil record going all the way back to the Carboniferous. And many of these early Carboniferous ferns were doing exactly what the Lycaopsids were doing, the club mosses. They were getting big, and they were starting to be a component of these early forests. So one of the interesting things you can do to tell if you have a fossil fern is to necessarily to look at some of these diagnostic features in the structure, the way they sort of build up their vascular structures. But the thing that really defines whether you have a fossil fern, of course, is the leaf structure. So the leaf structure of ferns is very diagnostic. You can find fossil ferns, and you instantly know you have a fossil fern, just because of the alternating nature of the leaves and the way the leaves are preserved in these fronds. So fossils of ferns are very common, and they're very easy to diagnose as ferns because of this structure. All right, so all of this stuff, all these plants were trying to become large forests. They were getting bigger and larger, and this is during the period of the Carboniferous. And here in North America, we split the Carboniferous into the Mississippian and Pennsylvanian periods. And so this is a very important time in terms of the diversification of many of these plants, and that these plants were getting big. They were starting to fill out and become forests. They were still living mostly in these very damp areas, so they needed a lot of moisture to live, but they were starting to spread out from these very moist areas. Now, when we think about what the paleogeography of the planet during the Carboniferous, during this period of time of the great proliferation of plants, there's something really interesting to note. The first thing is that we are entering into the period of time where we have Pangea, as we enter into the late Paleozoic of a single global continent. But before we heading into there, we had this major mountain range, the Appalachians. So the Appalachians extended and sort of between a North American continent and a European continent. So Europe and North America were smashed together, as well as with Africa coming up here, and where those two giant continents were wedged together was a major mountain feature, huge mountains. So that was the Appalachians. And so we still have them today because they're just slowly weathering away over the last 300 million years. Now, on either side of this big, huge mountain range, we had a major sort of rain shadow for both of these. So in Europe, we had the Paleotethys Seaway. So we had this big sea on the other side, and any rain or storms that would come would hit those mountains and just dump out the rain. On the back side, here in North America, there was not as much of these rainstorms, but those mountains would capture any storms that would come across these very dry plains that are located on this big continental shelf of the shallow seaway that composed most of the western part of the North American continent today. So if you think about the eastern seaboard of North America and Europe during this period of time, they were very wet areas, and they're both located right across the equator. So during this period of time, eastern North America, places like Mississippi and Pennsylvania, where we get those terms, as well as in Europe, was extremely wet, and these big forests started to grow. These big jungly forests began to grow at the equator during this period of time. So we get this really amazing fossil record of this very lush tropical forest type environment where we have the first forests. But these plants are very unique. They're not like what we see today. So there's wonderful artists that have reconstructed many of the features that you might have seen in many of these amazing Carboniferous periods of time. Bizarre, large trees, very frond-like, looking like, ancient primordial plants. And of course, the fossils of the Carboniferous are world famous for paleontologists to study, especially in places like Europe and eastern North America. Now, another reason that the Carboniferous is well studied is because this is the first time where we really start getting coal, the production of coal on a massive, massive scale. So much of North America's mining of coal comes from the eastern seaboard in places like Pennsylvania and Kentucky and the Appalachians, and of course the same is true in Europe. So coal was mined, and as they were mining, they were finding all sorts of amazing fossils from this period of time during the Paleozoic. So all of this organic matter, all these trees and leaf matter and wood that are being produced by these massive forests during this period of time were being rapidly buried at the foot of these Appalachian Mountains, and they were contributing to coal. And they're really old coal, so you're talking 300 million years ago. So this is coal that's been buried and turned into a anthracite, so it has that very tough coal. It's very different than the coals that we'll see in the Cretaceous. So this coal is very old, very deep, and it's composed of many of these plants, these lycophytes and these ferns, and are not composed of the angiosperms and gymnosperms, the seed plants that we're going to see later on. Now, all of this, these trees and these forests during this period of time had a profound effect also on the atmosphere. So all of these plants, they're now kind of coming out. They still require wet environments, but they're getting better and better at only requiring it to be wet just a few times a year for sexual reproduction. But other than that, they do pretty well. So they can grow in any place where there's good amounts of rain. So any place near a coast would be great places for many of these plants to live in. And then we have big forests. So we're taking down a lot of CO2 out of the atmosphere. And many of these plants are also producing a large amount of oxygen. So we get this accentuation of oxygen into the atmosphere. And some estimates put it around 35% of the atmosphere during the height of the Carboniferous was oxygen. This is much greater than today's 20.9% of the atmosphere is composed of oxygen. And this meant some certain things that could happen. So insects could get much bigger because their book lungs were more efficient to getting oxygen. The other thing is that forest fires became probably more common. The atmosphere itself became more combustible because oxygen is a catalyst for fire and for the oxidation of certain hydrocarbons and certain fuels. So you had a more heightened period of possible explosive activity in many of these forests. So you have the first forest fires. So this is setting up a really interesting pattern. It's really amazing to think about a period of time in which there was a much greater amount of oxygen in the atmosphere. All right, thank you again for watching another lecture at Utah State University. If you're interested in taking a course, check out our website at geology.usu.edu. And if you're interested in who I am and my research, check out my website at benjamin-berger.org. Thanks for watching.